Welcome to the Creator's Crypt. My name is Russ Adams. I was a special effects artist for over 25 years. I created creatures and props for films, television, and even commercials. I wrote 6 how-to books on special effects projects, and I starred on a reality show where we had to build creature suits and animatronic puppets in 2 to 3 days. So artistically speaking, I feel like I have a lot of experience to share. But enough of that. Let's get into this art stuff.
You want how much? Come on, it's not like it took a lot of effort.
Welcome to the Creator's Crypt, and again, my name is Russ Adams. Full disclosure, I like to bring a lot of my own personal experience into the conversation when we're talking about a particular subject on the podcast. It's my way of showing that I actually have experience with the subject. So if you're wondering why I talk about things that have happened to me, that's why. So let's get into this. I need you all to buckle up because I feel like this season, I'm going to take the gloves off. You're probably wondering what that whole thing at the beginning was, where I was like,
You want how much? It's not like it takes a lot of effort.
basically, this is what a lot of artists hear when they're talking to a customer or a prospective client. So how much effort really goes into artwork? Now, I can't speak on behalf of painters or pottery makers or photographers, but I've done things like graphic art, illustration. I've dabbled a little bit into animation, and I've made a butt ton of creatures. I mean a metric butt ton of creatures. Since my skills are based in creature making, let's talk about that. And let's shrink this thing down from a creature suit, which is really, really big, to something a little smaller. So how much effort does it take to make something like this? Well, grab some popcorn and maybe a beer because you're about to get a crash course in little creature design. So let's start with the design work. Am I building a custom creature for you, the client, or am I building it for myself to sell later? Either way, the design phase is going to be pretty intense. But it's actually going to be worse if you, the client, are involved. Yeah, it's going to be worse if the client is involved. Why? Well, simply put, because you're fucking stupid. I mean, really stupid. And every artist thinks so. They're just too polite to tell you, but I'm not. I have no problem calling a moron a moron. So why are you, the client, so stupid? Because you don't do your research. You don't know shit about the process, but you think you do. You interject when you really just need to shut the hell up and listen to the professional. Because it's what we do. So let's take the moron out of the equation. And in case you were wondering, that moron is, the client. We're going to simplify it by making this a project that I'm creating for myself. And by simplifying it, we're going to take a lot of that effort and shrink it down. It's kind of the point of the original comment stated by the client at the beginning of the podcast.
How much effort does it really take?
There are going to be hours of research, picking and choosing images from the internet that are going to help you create the creature that you want. And you're going to look at a ton of images and build a reference guide. Now, I can't show you these images on my podcast because, copyright. It's that little thing that we artists kind of respect. It's the law. And we don't necessarily like other artists. But that's a podcast for another day. But we certainly don't want to rip them off. And we don't want to be ripped off either. So everyone respects the copyright. So I won't be showing those images here. So we've taken those images and we've compiled a design through those images. Maybe we like the eyes of one creature, the nose of another, maybe the posture of another. But we combine all those together to create a rough design in our minds. Prototyping is a good next step. This is where I take my design and I'll sculpt out a really rough, sculpture of that character. And basically the sole purpose of this is to pull a pattern from that character. Now, if the client was involved, this is where I have to deal with a lot of whining.
That sculpture's too rough. Where's the detail? That sculpture's too small. It was supposed to be this big.
But this stage isn't about detail, and it's not about size, dumbass. This is about shapes. It's about pulling a pattern off of the sculpture that we can use, and it can be resized. Detail isn't a factor because you can't pattern the detail. But I don't have a moron to deal with. There isn't going to be days explaining this simple and obvious process. I don't want to go straight into sewing the actual body. This is a completely new critter, so I want to test the pattern out. Why? Because fur costs money, and I would rather make those mistakes on the cheaper muslin. Now that leaves me with something like this. He's cute and bald, isn't he? This is a prototype. This lets me see what worked at the pattern and what didn't. If there was a client involved, I would have to explain why the werewolf was bald. So to get here, I had to cut those pattern pieces out and assemble them by hand. I hand sew everything because I don't trust machines. And as I'm sewing this together by hand, I'm getting an idea of how long it's going to take me to sew the fur version. Okay, so I have my prototype. I've scaled it up to the size I want. Now I can start sculpting things like the head, the hands, and the feet. Those will be the resin parts that will attach to the plush version later on. This is probably going to take me another day or two. Even though I sculpt fast, I really want this to be right. Not just because it's for me, I would do the same thing for the client. I want to make sure that it looks the way it needs to look. Once I have those sculptures, I'm going to move on to the next step. But before I do, let's talk a little bit about the materials that are going to come into play. Every artist is going to have material costs. It's going to be different for each one. Different disciplines are going to require different materials. You as the client have just happened to come to someone who requires a lot of materials to create your vision. Muslin is cheap. That's about $5 for a yard, but it is necessary. The fur, on the other hand, is going to cost anywhere between $30 and $40. I need a minimum of about 1/4 of a yard of this fur to create this character.
But you use so little of the muslin. Why do you need a whole 1/4 of a yard of the fur?
Asks the moron.
Are you trying to pad the bill?
No.
Again, from experience, I know that when I cut into muslin, I can cut into it any way I want for that prototype. But when I start working with the fur, there's this thing called fur direction. I have to cut each pattern piece to a specific direction of the fur, which means I can't lay out the pattern all ski-wampus and make it fit, to use less fur. Because the damn thing will look stupid. So yeah, I need more fur than I do muslin. I also have the cost of clay. Now, I might have clay on hand, but I have a lot of other projects going on, so I might not. I may have to order it. And clay, believe it or not, is pretty pricey. The stuff I use is called monster clay, and for about 4.5 ounces, I'm going to pay about $40 to $50. Hey, I don't make the prices. Now, I plan to mold these sculptures, and from experience, I know the rule of thumb. Rigid cast, flexible mold. Flexible cast, rigid mold. So I need to create a flexible mold, which is basically silicone. And that way I can produce a resin cast of the head, the feet, and the hands. Now, silicone has always been pricey, but ever since the pandemic, it's gotten worse. And we all know that when the price of something goes up, regardless of the economy, it ain't ever coming back down. So I'm looking at about $120 in silicone alone just to make those molds, if I'm lucky. Since I'm also going to need resin, I'll add that too. I'll probably just pick up a few trial kits because that's enough, I feel like, from experience, that it's going to take to cast all of these parts. We're looking at about $90 for that resin. Now, I order them both from the same place so I can order them at the same time. And from past experience, I know that order is going to cost me $246. That's the material itself, the sales tax, and the shipping. If you're keeping track, we are now at $291 because of, the fur. And I haven't even put a damn thing together yet. And I also know from experience that a silicone mold is more than just the silicone part. I need a rigid cover, which is basically referred to as a mother mold or a jacket mold. That's going to be fiberglass. The fiberglass is going to cost another $40 for the resin and the matte glass. And I'll use the toxic polyester fiberglass resin, so that we can save a few bucks, because fuck my health, you're welcome. I'll need adhesive, but I think I'm pretty good on that. I think I have it in-house. Now, the stuff I use, the stuff that a lot of people use, is called barge contact cement, and I buy it by the gallon. Now, this gallon costs about $75. But it goes a long way, so I'm not really worried about it. I'll go ahead and just not include that in the price. Consumables are going to be insane. Okay, so when we get a mold and we pour the resin in, we do a little thing, especially with smaller molds, we'll do this thing called rotocasting. And I need that mold to stay together while I'm rotocasting. So that means hardware. That means bolts, nuts, and washers. And you're looking at about another $50 just in hardware. If you don't believe me, go to Lowe's. You're going to look for 1/4-inch size bolts, maybe about an inch and a half long. You're also going to need the nuts and you're going to need the washers. So do the math. And I'm probably going to need at least 20 of them because I have the head mold, the hand mold, and the foot mold. I'm also going to need things like chip brushes for the fiberglass when I start to spread that around for the jacket mold. I'm also going to need mixing cups, mixing sticks, mold release, thread for sewing, latex gloves so I don't get that shit on my hands, and a dust mask because I really don't want to breathe too much dust. I've already got the chemicals in my system from that toxic polyester fiberglass that we saved money on. So that's another $50, conservatively speaking. Oh, and I'm also going to need some Magic Sculpt so that I can mount things together. And that's about $50 itself. So now we're in the neighborhood of $480. I won't count paint. I'll treat that like I did the barge, contact cement. I have it, so, Now let's talk about the tools. Of course, you're going to have some of these on hand already because you've spent years as a professional building up your shop, building up your tool, kit. Because you do this stuff for a living. You're going to need things like a drill bits, a Dremel, so on, scissors, paint brushes, and a lot of other supplies. Grinders, what have I forgotten? But there are also going to be specialty tools that you don't have on hand that are specific to this build. Things like armatures. You'll need an armature to sculpt over, and it needs to be a specific size based on your creature design and able to handle, a specific girth depending upon how big this thing is. That's armature wire, and that's more that Magic Sculpt or probably plumber's epoxy because it kicks off a lot faster. And we haven't even talked about the number of appendages this thing might have. Hopefully, it's like my werewolf and it just has the 2 arms, the 2 legs, and a head. But it could be an octopus for all I know. But what about things like specific jigs that you might need for creating things like doll joints? In my case, I've already created a mold for the doll joints and I use them for every one of my resin plushies that I build because I got sick of waiting for the cheap shit that came from China and I started building my own. But beyond the materials and the tools, there's the know-how. How do you think that these artists are able to do the things that they're able to do? Because of years and years of hard work, trial and error, mishaps, successes, and recognition. It was amassed into a skill set. But does that factor into a client's definition of value? I should hope so. Because as artists, we have worked years to better hone our skills. The client has also been working years to better hone their skills. They've had years of experience in the jobs that they do. They may have had to get certifications, taken seminars, listened to lectures, so that they could put together a resume for their next job or promotion that says,
"Hey, I've earned this gig."
"Well, douchebag, we've earned it too. We've taken the classes, we've gotten our degrees, we've honed our skills so that we're professional craftsmen." Craftspeople. Only the client in their everyday world doesn't have to prove themselves every goddamn day. But artists do. We have to endure this self-promoting conversation with every jackass that walks into our shop. We have to prove it again and again to each one of those people. Clients, they just do it during their interviews, and they won't do it again until their next job interview or promotion. They don't have to prove themselves through a revolving door of the dumbest fucks on earth. But we do. Okay, so to make this resin plushie thing that you thought was overpriced, this is what I had to do. I had to design it from only an idea. Then I prototyped it to make sure that it worked. I sewed the fur together all by hand. I sculpted the head, the hands, and the feet. Then I molded those pieces, which in itself is an undertaking, I might add. I've had to rotocast it until the resin kicked on the head, the hands, the feet, whatever parts are necessary, which is a lot of turning, I might add. This is rotocasting. And your arms hurt when you're done. Oh, and then there's the fiberglass in your fingers. That feels real good. Because it always seems to get through the damn glove. I don't know how. I demolded the cast, cleaned it real good, got it prepped, primered, and started to paint it. Then I attached those doll joints to all the limbs. And because of the fact that I want this thing to stay together, there's a lot of redundancies. So I sew the doll joints into place so that, it's less likely that there's a mishap. They're sewn together and then they're glued together. There's so much shit with those goddamn doll joints. But don't forget, I also made those doll joints. That's right. Then I fill that sucker with fiber fill, stitch it on up so none of that fiber fill comes out. Then I glue the head, the hands, and the feet to the body with some industrial shit. Then I packaged it up and got it ready to ship. So the cost of a custom resin plushie, in this case, is just the materials is $600. Probably $750 if there are additional details, like in this case with the werewolf. Those fingies right there, those get mounted separately, so I had to create a separate mold for all the fingers, cast those, and then attach them to the hand with Magic Sculpt. So that's $600 to $750 in materials. But let's talk about the labor. Let's say that we as artists actually like to be paid for our work, because that's a thing nowadays. We're talking about upwards of 60 to 80 hours to drag this idea into the real world. So let's assume, on a very small scale, that we're going to pay ourselves $15 an hour to do all this, which is sort of laughable because you're really looking at anywhere from $25 to $90 an hour to do this. But for the sake of the pearl clutchers, we'll just go ahead and say 15. Now that's $15 an hour times 60 to 80 hours for the project. We're looking at anywhere from $900. We're looking at anything from $900 to $1,200 in just labor. But pearl clutchers, we're just going to call it $900. It's okay. We're going to work super duper fast and try to keep the hours to 60 just for you. Now it's a grand total of $1,650 to create that custom resin plushie, cute as hell, right? For you. It didn't exist in the world until someone like me, another artist, drug it into the real world. That's the cost of doing so. Now, in the case of this little guy, he's not a one-off. He isn't going to cost $1,650. Instead, I did all that work so that I could ensure that I could make multiples. Okay, so I took that setup and tooling costs, about $925, and I divided it across 75 of these. So I'm going to need to sell 75 of these to be able to pay for all my tooling. So the price of this includes about $12.35 in tooling costs. Now, from experience, I know that it takes me about 30 hours to get one of these from raw materials to the critter that you saw. Sometimes 40, but 30. But since all the technical work is done and all I have left is, that hand sewing and the painting and the assembly, maybe I'll just reduce my labor costs to the ballpark of $7 an hour. That's slightly below minimum wage. So I've earned myself a whopping $210 for the creation of this one character. Again, not the one-off, but one of the many that will be multiplied across, my hopeful sales future. That includes $75 for the materials, again, the $210 for my labor, and the $12.35 for the tooling. I'm asking $300 for these hand-sewn, hand-painted, hand-assembled werewolves that took me 30 hours worth of work to create. And the client or the customer is beside themselves about the cost of this item. When you as the client are about to pay someone to create something from an idea and bring it to life, you should really think for a moment before you start criticizing the price. Because there are some things to consider. Number one, if you can do it, then shut the fuck up and do it. If you can't, then shut the fuck up and pay for it. Number two, do you really know what goes into the process of creating that? And if you don't, do some goddamn research. The research ain't hard. That way, you kind of know what's going on, so you're not as surprised by the price, and you don't come off as a complete douchebag. Number three, have an educated and reasonable budget in mind. If you've done your research, then you'll know a little bit of what to expect. And if the price is a little high, maybe you could haggle a little bit, but on a reasonable level. Custom means one of a kind. It means all of the other work that went into it, all those drawings, all those molds, sculptures, all that shit, patterns, those are all one and dones. They're going in the trash. That artist cannot make another version of what you wanted and sell it. Because your custom piece was basically custom. It was something that you wanted. Nobody else is going to want the rainbow-furred fairy piglet in the ballet costume. So suggesting that they could sell another version of it to make up the difference is a damn joke. It's not going to happen. In my 30 years in the industry, it has never happened. Custom shit remains custom shit, and you never sell another copy. So again, that custom one-off is going to cost you the whole, in this case, $1,650. Buyer, client, dumbass, educate yourself before you contact and insult an artist. Yeah, that's the cost. Was there a lot of effort? Thank you for listening or watching this episode of Creator's Crypt. It was a joy to bring this subject to you. And I hope that this week's episode was able to shed some light on that client misconception. I'd like to thank all my friends over at the Collector's Maze Network. If you guys are looking for a network of podcasts that are all things geek, then look no further than the Collector's Maze Network. They've got fan-based podcasts, toy podcasts, and even pop culture podcasts. It's a plethora of podcasts, all things geek. So go check them out. the Collector's Maze Network. And I would also like to thank my friend Gil Corzo for supplying me with this awesome music for my podcast. Until next time, educate your clients and keep that creativity flowing.